Chapter 1. It was a Tuesday in late spring, and the village of Little Wibcombe lay drowsy beneath a veil of honeysuckle and warm breeze. The hedgerows hummed with bees, the postman whistled through his route, and in the Giggling Goose pub, the social heart of the village, a gathering was under way. Nothing grand, merely a charity committee meeting for the upcoming May Day fair. But, as always in Little Wibcombe, a small gathering could unearth large tensions. The Giggling Goose, a timber-beamed inn with ivy crawling up its sagging roof, prided itself on being charmingly local. Its owner, Rupert Bligh, liked to remind patrons of the pub's long lineage. It had survived 2 wars, 3 generations of Bligh landlords, and one particularly nasty outbreak of dysentery after a dodgy meat pie in '53. Tonight, the back room buzzed with the usual suspects. Reverend Percy Blunt, upright and tired, his clerical collar starched into submission. Mrs. Ida Pirbright, chairwoman and relentless organizer. Mr. Colin Lacey, owner of the garage and forever underdressed. And young Miss Geraldine Pratt, the fair's musical coordinator and, by consensus, the village's most disapproving soprano. Miss Marple had not been invited, per se, but she had wandered in quite by accident, or so she claimed, to return a lost scarf. Somehow, she had found herself seated by the hearth, with a cup of lukewarm tea, gently observing the undercurrents at play. "What we need," said Mrs. Pirbright sharply, "is more spectacle. A parade, perhaps, with costumes and ducks." "There's not enough ducks," Colin Lacey muttered into his pint. Geraldine's lips tightened. "And where do you suppose we'll get trained ducks, Mrs. Pirbright? Should we lure them out of the vicar's pond with crumbs and good intentions?" Reverend Blunt cleared his throat. "Perhaps a choir would be simpler." "It's not about simplicity, Reverend," said Mrs. Pirbright. "It's about spirit. And if there's one thing this village lacks lately, it's spirit." Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. "Oh, I don't know," she said, her tone mild. "Villages have spirits of all kinds. Some simply hide beneath the surface." There was a pause. Her words, light though they were, hung in the air like smoke. Just then the pub door opened with a bang, and in came Ivy Baxter, barmaid and part-time clairvoyant. Her cheeks were flushed with either wind or temper. "Mr. Bligh's had another row," she whispered dramatically to Geraldine, "with that man from the brewery. Said he wouldn't be pushed around." "Rupert's always rowing," Geraldine replied coolly. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the bar. Rupert Bligh was indeed standing there, jaw clenched as he wiped a pint glass with unnecessary aggression. A tall man with thinning auburn hair and a fondness for suspenders, Rupert had inherited the Giggling Goose from his father and spent the past 15 years turning it into his stage. He liked his beer strong, his music soft, and his villagers obedient. "He does seem out of sorts tonight," Miss Marple murmured. "Probably upset over that land sale," said Reverend Blunt. "There's talk the Giggling Goose might be, well, purchased." That stirred the group. Mrs. Pirbright sat straighter. "Purchased? By whom?" "No one knows, but if the pub goes corporate—" Blunt trailed off. "Disaster," muttered Colin Lacey. "You think Rupert'll go quietly? He's the kind who'd rather set fire to the bar than sell it to some money man." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the words. "Sometimes people don't show what they're willing to do until it's too late." As the conversation drifted back to maypoles and raffle baskets, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the bar. Rupert Bligh's jaw still pulsed with silent fury, and his eyes were locked on someone at the far end of the room. There sat Mr. Jasper Mottram, newly arrived in Little Whipcombe, and already stirring unease. A tall, silver-templed man with a sleek moustache and 2 perfect cufflinks, he claimed to be a property developer, interested in preserving local character, he had said at the last parish meeting. But his smile had too many teeth, and no one could quite say where he came from, or why he'd arrived so suddenly. Miss Marple watched as Rupert refilled a glass of whisky, not his usual, and placed it before Mr. Mottram without a word. Their eyes met for the briefest second. The glass clinked gently on the wood. From the hearth, Miss Marple's voice floated through the room again, soft and unobtrusive. "Whisky's such a strong drink for a spring evening." Mr. Mottram turned toward her and gave a cool smile. "It's never the wrong season for the right spirit, Miss Marple." The old lady gave a little nod, as if she agreed, and yet the smallest furrow had formed between her brows. The next morning, the village awoke to an announcement that rippled like a dropped stone through still water. Mr. Jasper Mottram was dead, found slumped in his chair in the private corner of the Giggling Goose, an untouched glass of whisky before him. The cause, said the doctor, was heart failure. Nothing suspicious, no violence, no drama. A man with weak health, perhaps too much drink, and the quiet end of a solitary evening. But Miss Marple, who happened to pass by just as the constable was leaving, asked a curious question. Was the glass full when they found him? The constable frowned. No, half empty. Why? Oh, nothing, Miss Marple said with a small smile. Only I thought he never took a sip. And with that, she moved on, her footsteps quiet on the cobblestones, her thoughts anything but. Chapter 2. The official report came by midday. Dr. Albert Cray, the village's somewhat scatterbrained physician, had concluded that Jasper Mottram had suffered a sudden cardiac event, likely exacerbated by stress and alcohol. There would be no post-mortem. Unfortunate, he'd said, wringing his hands as he fumbled with his spectrum. Unfortunate, he'd said, wringing his hands as he fumbled with his spectacles. But not unheard of at his age. 57? Yes, quite possible. Blood pressure like a kettle on the boil. Miss Marple, who had been present during the pronouncement, quietly knitting at the periphery of the pub's lounge, offered no comment. She merely glanced at the glass. It had since been cleared away, along with the chair, the man, and the tension that had briefly electrified the air. But Miss Marple remembered the exact angle at which it had rested. Slanted, and yet the surface of the drink had been motionless. A man who dies suddenly while drinking doesn't place his glass down so neatly. At least, not in her experience. By that evening, the Giggling Goose was both subdued and buzzing. Grief wore peculiar clothes in Little Whipcombe. The villagers were torn between proper mourning and juicy speculation, and few things stirred the imagination more than a death that happened without warning and without noise. Just gone, was he? Ivy Baxter asked for the 6th time as she dried pint glasses with nervous energy. Didn't cry out, didn't slump over or make a scene. Like a light switch, said Colin Lacey, shaking his head. Poor sod. Mrs. Pirbright leaned forward conspiratorially. They say he came from London, but no one's quite certain where in London. Did he even have family? A brother, Rupert Bligh muttered from behind the bar, his voice dry as gin. some solicitor or something, asked me for the address. I told him I didn't pry into customers' lives." Geraldine Pratt, nursing a sherry, gave a soft snort. "No, Rupert, but you listen hard enough when they talk." Miss Marple, seated once again near the hearth, placed her teacup down on the saucer. "It is curious, isn't it," she said gently, "how someone can be so very present one evening, and so completely absent the next." There was a pause, during which the fire popped and hissed. "Life's like that," said Rupert with a shrug. "Death too," added Ivy, with a shiver. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the corner where Mr. Mottram had sat. The space looked the same, but felt different. A void remained, a hollow space not made of absence, but of unanswered questions. The next morning brought more than mist to Little Wibcombe. Detective Inspector Graves, summoned from Minster due to procedural requirements, an out-of-towner dying in a local pub still needed official attention, arrived in a mackintosh far too clean for village streets. He was trim, dry-voiced, and not inclined toward village nonsense. No signs of struggle, no bruising, no injuries. Medical opinion says natural causes, but, he said, fixing Rupert Bligh with a stare, the man was in your establishment when he died, so I need your version of events, fully. Rupert folded his arms. He came in, sat down in his usual spot, ordered a whisky. I served him. 10 minutes later, Ivy found him with his head back and eyes open. Ivy nodded quickly. Didn't look asleep. Looked gone. Gave me a chill, it did. "Did he say anything?" Graves asked. Rupert hesitated. "Just thank you. Same as always." The inspector scribbled that down, frowning. Miss Marple stood just behind the inspector's shoulder, seemingly absorbed in adjusting her gloves. She said nothing, but she noticed something. Rupert Bligh was left-handed. She remembered how he'd served the drink the night before, reaching with his right hand across the bar, awkwardly, as though avoiding something. And the glass had been placed exactly opposite Jasper Mottram's dominant hand. An odd detail. Small, but so often it was the small things that tipped the balance. Outside the pub, Miss Marple found herself intercepted by Reverend Blunt, who looked unusually harried. "I say, Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you don't think there's more to this, do you?" She tilted her head. "Why would you say that, Reverend?" He glanced around. "Well, the whole thing, it doesn't sit right." Jasper had been asking about property rights. He approached the church about that old barn near the rectory. Wanted to lease it. For what purpose? Wouldn't say. Just smiled that slick smile of his, and said it was for community enrichment. Miss Marple smiled thinly. "And did you agree?" I told him I'd think on it, but something in his manner gave me pause. As they parted ways, Miss Marple turned onto the high street, her pace unhurried. The pieces were small and scattered, an untouched drink, a forced smile, a local landlord with a temper, a stranger with no past, and yet the village itself felt watchful, like it knew something but wouldn't say. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor. It was Geraldine Pratt, looking uncharacteristically flushed. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" "Of course, dear. Come in, tea." Geraldine waved it off. "No, thank you. Well, something's been bothering me, and I didn't want to say it in front of the others." Miss Marple gestured to the chair beside the lace-draped window. "You're quite right. Some things require quieter surroundings." Geraldine sat, twisting her hands. "It's about Rupert. Last week I overheard him on the telephone. I was coming in to rehearse a piece on the pub's piano, and he didn't notice me." "What did he say?" He said he wasn't going to let some slick bastard from the city take away his family's name, that he'd handle it one way or another." "Did he mention Jasper by name?" "No, but it doesn't take much to connect the dots, does it?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And did he know you heard?" "I don't think so, but he's been odd since, watchful, as if trying to gauge what I might say." "And now that Mr. Mottram is gone, you feel unsafe?" Geraldine nodded. "Silly, isn't it? But yes, not silly at all," said Miss Marple. "Not in the slightest." She stood, moving to the window. The village square shimmered in the soft gold of afternoon. It all looked so serene. And yet the layers beneath had begun to shift. Guilt, fear, secrets pushing to the surface. "Miss Pratt," she said softly, "may I ask, was Mr. Mottram left-handed?" "I don't know why." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because I suspect the whiskey glass was." Chapter 3. By the third day, the death of Jasper Mottram had begun to shift from shock to speculation. Not official speculation. Inspector Graves had already left Little Wibcombe with his notebook full of mundane observations and a polite promise to remain available should anything further arise. But the village had taken up the slack. In every corner shop, garden fence, and washing line, the talk circled. How a man so composed could collapse so suddenly. How someone who drank only one whiskey could end the night dead. And most persistently, why had Rupert Bligh looked so calm afterward? At the Giggling Goose, Rupert carried on as if nothing had happened. He polished the taps, barked for silence during the darts tournament, and even posted a new sign on the wall. "No credit, no excuses, no solicitors." Miss Marple stopped in for tea that afternoon. Ivy Baxter was behind the bar again, her mood brittle. "He hasn't said a word about it," she whispered as she poured hot water over a tea bag in a chipped white mug. "Not even to me, and I've known him since we were both 12, and in Miss Harker's class. He talks about taxes, weather and beer shipments, but not a word about Mr. Mottram." "Some men," said Miss Marple, "find silence preferable to explaining things they fear might sound too reasonable." Ivy blinked. "You think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I think he's avoiding something, which is not quite the same, but very close cousins." She accepted her tea and moved quietly to her usual seat near the hearth. Rupert was cleaning behind the bar with exaggerated care, but he glanced at her as she settled. "Busy week," he muttered across the room. "So I gather. Not how I wanted things to go." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Things rarely go the way we want, especially when people arrive with plans of their own." Rupert's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think he had plans?" "Oh, I think he was very interested in the appearance of plans." There was a long pause. Then Rupert set down his cloth and came out from behind the bar. "What is it you want, Miss Marple?" She looked up calmly. "Truth, Mr. Bligh. Nothing more." Rupert snorted. "Truth is overpoured, same's a cheap pint. Everyone wants their own taste of it." Later that day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Reverend Blunt's vicarage. He greeted her in the parlour, his sleeves rolled up, sorting through a box of old church receipts and hymnals. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was hoping you'd come. Sit, please, do." She seated herself with ease. "I wondered if Mr. Mottram had returned any documents after your conversation about the barn." Blunt frowned thoughtfully. In fact, he'd promised to send something in writing, but never did." "Curious," Miss Marple said. He made inquiries at the parish, the pub, even the council office, but never committed anything to paper. It's as though he wanted to stir the water, but not fish in it. Blunt looked troubled. He was a disruptive influence, but I don't know that he was dangerous. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Danger is a quiet visitor, Reverend. It rarely knocks. That evening, Colin Lacey hosted a quiet drink in his garage office for a few village friends. Miss Marple, by sheer coincidence, had brought her knitting to sit nearby. It was amazing what men muttered when they thought a grey-haired woman wasn't listening. Old Rupert looked like a storm cloud at the darts last night, Colin said. Wouldn't even cheer when I hit treble 20. Still reeling from Mottram, maybe, muttered Ted Grover, the butcher. Or relieved, Colin countered. I heard the brewery contract's off. The company's backing out. Can't blame them. Who wants a dead body in the brand? You saying Rupert's glad the bloke's dead? Ted asked, voice dropping. Colin shrugged. I'm saying it came convenient, that's all. Miss Marple looped a thread neatly around her needle. Convenient, she thought. So often the motive no one says aloud. The next morning brought an unexpected visit. A car pulled up outside Miss Marple's cottage, black, polished, and very out of place among the daffodils and cobblestones. A man emerged, late 30s, clean suit, and a hollow, restless face. Miss Marple? Yes, I'm Lionel Mottram, Jasper's brother. May I come in? She led him inside with quiet politeness. Once seated, he refused tea but accepted silence. For nearly a minute, he stared at his clasped hands. I don't believe it was natural, he said finally. My brother, he had issues, yes, but not his heart. Miss Marple inclined her head. You suspect foul play? He nodded. I suspect intent. Jasper wasn't here to buy the pub. That was a front. A front for what? For laundering. Miss Marple did not blink. Go on. He was a fixer, Miss Marple. A cleaner. He brokered deals, quiet ones, for people who couldn't afford publicity. The pub was just a way in. And you believe someone found out? Someone always does. Lionel sighed. And when they do, they don't call the police. They serve the last drink. He rose then, buttoning his coat. Just thought someone here ought to know. The village has a charm. I'd hate to see it turn ugly. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts turning swiftly. Rupert had every reason to hate Jasper, for the business, the deception, the threat to his name. But there was something else too. Something in the way Ivy had trembled, the way Geraldine had hesitated, the way Rupert avoided every mention of Jasper's glass. Was it the contents of the glass, or the act of serving it, that mattered most? As dusk fell, Miss Marple strolled past the Giggling Goose and paused just outside. Through the small front window, Rupert could be seen alone, wiping a table. She noted something he did not realize he was doing. He reached for a glass with his left hand, wiped it, then replaced it with the right. Perfectly aligned, symmetrical. Habit, ritual, precision. The same kind of precision used to place a glass so that it will be lifted with the wrong hand. The kind of thing only a left-handed man would get exactly right, without thinking. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought as she turned away, without meaning to. Chapter 4. It was a Thursday morning draped in gentle drizzle, the sort that washed the stone walls of Little Wibcombe until they gleamed. The Giggling Goose pub remained closed. Rupert Bligh had posted a handwritten sign in the window, closed for private inventory. Back Friday. Most of the village assumed it was grief or weariness. A few whispered it was guilt. Miss Marple, however, saw something else in the note. Deflection. She chose not to speculate aloud, instead continuing her routine. Visiting the church to sort knitted items for the fair's charity stall. There she encountered Geraldine Pratt, who was struggling to tune the upright piano in the church hall, her lips drawn into a tight line. "You seem agitated, dear," Miss Marple said, sorting through a box of crocheted coasters. "It's this cursed E-flat," Geraldine muttered, "and something else." Miss Marple sat on the bench beside her. "The note or the man?" Geraldine didn't smile. "I went to the pub Tuesday evening, after Jasper died. I had a key. I was helping Rupert catalogue the music sheets in the back room. He'd forgotten I was coming." "Did you see anything unexpected?" "I heard something talking. Rupert and someone else. I couldn't see who. It was muffled. But they were arguing. Something about overstepping, and not what we agreed. Then I heard a glass smash." Miss Marple stilled. "Did Rupert see you?" "I don't think so. I left before they came out." Geraldine hesitated. "Miss Marple, I think he's hiding more than he lets on." "I think you're quite right." Miss Marple rose, her eyes thoughtful. "And you did well to tell me. But say nothing further to anyone. Not yet." By midday the drizzle had turned to mist, curling along the hedgerows like breath. Miss Marple paid a visit to Ivy Baxter, who lived in a small terraced cottage behind the bakery. Ivy, pale-faced and tired, let her in without a word. "I only want to ask one thing," Miss Marple said gently, "about the night Mr. Mottram died. You said you found him with the glass half empty." Ivy nodded. "It was sitting right there, next to his hand." "But you didn't see him drink?" "No." "And Rupert poured the drink himself?" "Yes." Miss Marple paused. "Did Rupert ever let anyone else pour for customers?" Ivy blinked. "Never. Not even me. He said it's about control. Says if something goes wrong, it should be his fault alone." "Curious philosophy," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet, how odd that a man who insists on control would pour with his non-dominant hand, wouldn't you say?" Ivy looked confused. "You mean his right? He's always used his left." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, "which is why it's strange." She thanked Ivy and left quietly, her mind carefully connecting the slow, delicate threads. That evening, word spread quickly that Rupert Bligh had been seen driving toward the next town, Matchminster, just after dark. A rare thing. He hated leaving the village. And so, when Miss Marple received a quiet knock at her door just past 8, she wasn't surprised to see Reverend Blunt standing on her stoop, hat in hand. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, "but something's been troubling me." She motioned him inside. "I looked through the church records again," he said, settling into the floral armchair, "and I found a note, a ledger entry. Mottram had placed a down payment on the barn." Miss Marple's eyes lit slightly. "But you said he never followed up in writing." "He didn't, but the money was there, paid in cash, quietly." "So he wanted it kept quiet," she murmured. "And now that money's in the church account, but the deal vanished." Blunt nodded. "And it gets stranger. The payment came through someone else." "Who?" Blunt hesitated. "Geraldine Pratt." Miss Marple blinked. "Geraldine? She transferred the funds, or at least signed the envelope. Why would she get involved in Mottram's business?" Miss Marple thought of the piano, the untuned E-flat, and the broken voice that had betrayed nothing in her earlier visit. "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "Mr. Mottram's dealings weren't just with Rupert." At 10 o'clock sharp, Miss Marple stood outside Geraldine's small cottage. The lights were still on, and, after a pause, the door opened a crack. "Miss Marple," Geraldine said, startled. "Is something wrong?" "That depends, dear," she replied, stepping gently inside. "On how much you'd like to tell me before someone else starts asking harder questions." Geraldine hesitated only a second before the door clicked shut behind them. "You're right," Geraldine said quietly. "I knew him before, years ago in London." She sat at her kitchen table, hands knotted together. "Jasper wasn't a developer. Not really. He brokered things, arrangements. He helped me once. Kept something out of the papers. Something that would have ruined my music career." "Blackmail?" "Not directly, but close. He did me a favour. I owed him, and when he came to Wibcombe, he called it in." "By asking you to fund the barn lease?" She nodded. "He promised it was just a placeholder. Said he'd disappear again once things were settled. But they weren't." Geraldine looked haunted. "He started hinting at owning part of the pub. Said Rupert's debts made him vulnerable. Said we could fix the village, turn it into something cleaner, sharper, more profitable." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And how did Rupert react?" "Fury. I tried to warn Jasper off, but he didn't listen. Said Rupert would come around, or break, I think. I think he pushed too hard." "Did you see Rupert after the argument?" "Number. But the next morning Rupert came to me and said, 'It's handled.' Just that. I didn't ask." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, Geraldine. That's all I needed." That night, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, hands resting in her lap. She had heard enough. Rupert Bligh had motive, protection of legacy, reputation and business. He had opportunity, the drink, the private setting, the secrecy. And now she had something more damning. Fear. Not rage, not revenge, but fear of exposure. A fear shared by others, but only one man had been alone with Jasper when he died. She reached for her notebook and wrote a single name. Then, beside it, she circled a word, mirror. Chapter 5. On Friday morning, the Giggling Goose reopened. It did so without fanfare or fresh flower displays. Only the chalkboard sign had changed. Back to normal, it read, though the words rang hollow. Villagers trickled in, quieter than usual, watching Rupert Bligh move behind the bar with practised efficiency and a studied lack of expression. Miss Marple arrived just after 11, slipping inside with her handbag neatly clasped and a mild smile for Ivy Baxter, who greeted her with tired eyes. "Same tea as always?" Ivy asked, "unless the whiskey is particularly good this morning." That earned the faintest grin. "I'll make the tea." Miss Marple took her usual seat near the hearth. The fire was lit, though the weather had grown warmer. The flames flickered behind the iron grate, crackling softly in the silence. Rupert appeared a few minutes later, brushing his hands on a towel. "We're low on lemon," he said aloud. To no one in particular. Miss Marple looked up at him mildly. "Lemons are useful things, especially in cleansing." He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I often find," she continued gently, "that things left unsaid have a way of curdling, much like milk in tea left too long on the tray." Rupert turned away. "If you've something to say, Miss Marple, you might as well say it." "I think," she said, "that Jasper Mottram never touched his whiskey, that the glass was positioned incorrectly, opposite his dominant hand. and I think only a left-handed man with a particular sense of balance would place it just so. His hands froze on the bar. I also think, she added, that the argument Geraldine overheard, the one you hoped she'd forget, wasn't your first with Mr. Mottram, nor the last. Rupert slowly poured a glass of water, hand steady. He was going to ruin this place, he said finally. Not just buy it, twist it into something else. A polished version of Wibcombe, with brochures and glossy signs. A brand, and you would no longer be the landlord. You'd be an employee. He looked at her with quiet intensity. He offered to keep my name on the deed. Said he'd make it easier for me. Less work, more money. Called it a kindness. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And you believed he would not stop there. He wouldn't have. He'd have pushed, and then pushed again. But did you poison him, Rupert? His face tightened. No. You poured the drink. I did, but I didn't touch it after that. I walked away. Did anyone else go near him before Ivy found him? No one, not that I saw. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then I believe you. He blinked. You do? You see, Rupert, the key to this matter isn't the pouring, but the presumption. You believed you gave him a drink. He believed he received one. But I wonder, was the glass Jasper drank from ever meant for him at all? That afternoon, Miss Marple made a quiet stop at the church. Reverend Blunt greeted her in his study, a pile of hymn sheets in his lap. Geraldine has withdrawn from the fair, he said. Says she's unwell. Miss Marple nodded. It's a rather convenient timing, I think, especially after her recent honesty. Blunt looked puzzled. You think she lied? Not lied, omitted. She took a small parcel from her handbag and placed it on his desk. Inside was a napkin from the Giggling Goose, creased, faintly stained. It came from the bar, she said. Ivy kept it because it had Jasper's initials on it, embossed with his monogram, Jasper M. Mottram. And yet I examined it closely. The ring mark from the whiskey glass was on the opposite side to where the monogram would face if it had been placed correctly. You mean? I mean the glass was set for someone else. It was never Jasper's drink. Reverend Blunt stared at her. Then whose was it? That, Miss Marple said softly, is the most important question we haven't asked. At dusk, Ivy Baxter found Miss Marple seated quietly outside the bakery, finishing a line of knitting. Miss Marple, she said, wringing her hands, I've remembered something odd. Oh? The glass Jasper had, the one Rupert poured. He left it untouched, as you said. But when I picked it up, it smelled wrong. Not whiskey, something sharper. Like spirits, number like polish, furniture polish. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. Did you say polish? Yes. I thought maybe it came from the cloth Rupert used, but I used the same one. It never smells like that. Miss Marple folded her knitting into her lap. That, she thought, changes everything. She returned to the pub that evening and asked to see Rupert once more. He emerged reluctantly from the back, wiping his hands. There's something I must ask, she said. Do you recall what Geraldine ordered the night Jasper died? Rupert frowned. She wasn't drinking, just water. And did she ever handle the glasses? Number she never touches anything on the bar. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. I think she did, just not visibly. I think the argument Geraldine heard wasn't about the barn. It was about Jasper backing out. Rupert stared at her. Backing out of what? Of protecting her. Geraldine had secrets to hide. Jasper was meant to help, but he changed the terms. Perhaps he asked for more. Perhaps he threatened to reveal the past. When Geraldine did what frightened people often do, she prepared a drink. Rupert's face was unreadable. She may not have meant to kill him, just frighten him, or stun him. But the drink was placed, possibly by you, unknowingly, on the wrong napkin. It wasn't her drink he received. It was his, or at least she thought so. And so did you. Rupert looked shaken. You think Geraldine? I think, said Miss Marple, the glass meant for Jasper was poured with something meant to silence, not kill, but the mix, furniture polish perhaps, interacted with the whiskey. A toxic mistake. And once he collapsed, she panicked. She paused. And you covered for her without knowing, because you believed it was your pour. A long silence settled. Then Rupert said, voice hoarse, You're sure? I'm sure of people, Rupert, not poisons, but I do know when someone's carrying the weight too heavy to bear. Chapter 6. The next morning arrived with heavy clouds and a metallic smell in the air, the kind that hinted at rain yet held back. Little Wibcombe moved slowly, as if the village itself were caught in its breath, waiting. Miss Marple walked the familiar path from her cottage to the churchyard, her steps measured and eyes attentive. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. In her experience, it was better to let things come to you. If you watched long enough, they usually did. And today, something did. Geraldine Pratt, standing alone by the iron gate near the war memorial, arms folded, face pale. She hadn't noticed Miss Marple at first. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, as though expecting it to speak. "Good morning, Miss Pratt," Miss Marple called gently. Geraldine startled. "Oh, I didn't hear you." "Few do," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. "I've always thought it useful not to be heard too quickly, especially when one's trying to understand things." Geraldine forced a smile, but said nothing. "Thinking of Mr. Mottram, are you?" She hesitated. "Yes, and of everything else." Miss Marple stepped closer. "You were fond of him once." Marple stepped closer. "You were fond of him once." Geraldine's eyes flashed, a storm behind them. "That was a lifetime ago. He helped me, but he never let me forget it." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "I imagine he didn't. And when someone's kindness begins to feel like a leash, it's only a matter of time before you try to cut it." Geraldine swallowed. "Are you accusing me?" "Not accusing, considering. Did you prepare that drink?" "I didn't poison anyone. Poison is a word too neat for what happened. I believe you added something to the glass. Not to kill, to buy silence." Geraldine looked away. "You can't prove that." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But the stains might." Geraldine blinked. "Stains? On the cloth, on the rim. Ivy mentioned a sharp scent. Polish, perhaps. Something that shouldn't have been there. The kind of detail you miss when you're in a panic, but not one that fades quickly." Geraldine's voice trembled. "I never meant to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop." "I know." The silence between them deepened. Geraldine clenched her jaw. "What are you going to do?" Miss Marple didn't answer at first. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Before you decide what to fear," she said, handing it over, "you should read this." Geraldine unfolded the page. It was a letter from Lionel Mottram, Jasper's brother. It read, "I want nothing from this village. No compensation, no scandal. My brother played a dangerous game, and I warned him of the consequences. I'm sorry for your loss, whatever form it takes." Geraldine looked up, breathless. "Why would he?" "Because guilt is a complicated thing," Miss Marple said gently, "and family even more so." Later that day, The pub remained quiet. Rupert Bligh was in the cellar checking stock when he heard footsteps above. He emerged to find Miss Marple waiting by the bar, a single glass turned upside down before her. "I think," she said, "we must speak plainly." Rupert wiped his hands. So it was her. She believed the drink was meant for her. Her fear was real. But she didn't kill him. Directly. Nor did you. But both of you have by silence, by assumption, allowed a truth to twist itself into something dangerous. He exhaled, slumping onto a stool. She told me it was handled. I thought she meant legally, blackmail maybe. I didn't ask, I just didn't want to know. Which, Miss Marple said, is precisely how many tragedies begin. Rupert looked up. You're not going to the police. I already did, she said simply. I told them everything I know, and nothing I don't. Without forensics or a confession, there's little they can act on. But why? Because justice, Miss Marple said, is not always the same as punishment. Geraldine is already serving a sentence, one of conscience, and you, if you wish to redeem your part in this, must choose whether you let silence fester again. Rupert stared at her. You think I should tell the village? I think, she said calmly, you should start by telling the truth to yourself. That evening, Miss Marple wrote in her diary, her pen gliding over the page like a whisper. Truth seldom arrives fully dressed. It trickles in, wearing the clothes of coincidence and fear. And when it finally stands revealed, it does not always demand applause, only acknowledgment. She closed the book and listened to the ticking of the clock on her mantel. Outside, the wind stirred the lilacs. Somewhere, the giggling goose lights flickered on again. And though the village would never truly know all that had happened inside that old timber pub, it would sense something had changed. That a shadow had passed, and though it left no name, its shape remained in memory. Chapter 7. Saturday morning brought with it a thick hush, the kind that blankets a village not from lack of activity, but from too much left unsaid. At the Giggling Goose, the door stood ajar with a small chalk sign that read quietly open. Few patrons came in, and those who did kept their voices low, as if the walls themselves were listening. Miss Marple sat in the rear corner by the narrow window, sipping her tea and reading the parish newsletter. She appeared to be absorbed in an article about choir auditions, but her attention lay elsewhere, on the quiet rhythm of the pub, on Ivy Baxter's too hasty glances, and on the way Rupert's shoulders stiffened every time someone mentioned the Mottram business. She had expected ripples from the truth. What she hadn't expected was the stillness that followed. It was unnatural, almost like a second silence had begun. After midday, a newcomer arrived in the village. A man in his late 60s, dressed in a brown tweed coat with brass buttons and scuffed leather shoes. He had the lean build of someone who had once stood at attention, but now walked like someone who'd learned not to rush. He introduced himself at the pub as Mr. Griggs from the county records office. Looking into old deeds, he explained. Heard there's a bit of property interest out this way. A pub and a church barn. Rupert poured him a pint. All inquiries go through the parish council or the solicitor. Mr. Griggs sipped. Interesting how many inquiries there've been lately. Seems there was some misfiling. Names on records that don't match transfers. Payments marked, but not signed for. Rupert's brow furrowed. What exactly are you saying? Nothing, said Mr. Griggs mildly. Not yet, just gathering crumbs. Miss Marple, at her table, gently folded her newspaper. Crumbs, she thought, always led to cake, if you follow them properly. By the afternoon, the village mood had shifted from uneasy silence to nervous activity. Geraldine Pratt had not been seen all day. The choir rehearsal had been postponed, and the Reverend's message board now bore a new note. Sunday's service to include a special reading on truth and repentance. All welcome. Miss Marple passed the notice with a quiet nod and continued on to the small grocer's shop. Inside, Colin Lacey was speaking in low tones to the butcher, Ted Grover. "They're saying Rupert might lose the place anyway," Colin muttered. "Drury's still nervous. Might pull the whole agreement." Ted rubbed the back of his neck. "You think he did it?" Colin hesitated. But he didn't not do something. Miss Marple stepped to the counter as though she'd heard nothing. "Half a pound of Darjeeling, please, Mr. Lacey." Colin jumped. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you come in." "I often arrive when people aren't looking," she said with a pleasant smile. "It helps one understand more than one's meant to." As she accepted her parcel of tea, she added softly, "Funny, isn't it, how things go missing even in a small village? People, paperwork, intentions." Ted blinked. "What's missing now?" Miss Marple glanced toward the church tower. "We'll find out soon, I imagine." That evening, just after sunset, Geraldine Pratt reappeared. She arrived not in a flurry, nor in shame, but with an eerie calm that unsettled even Ivy, who was wiping glasses when Geraldine entered the pub. She walked straight to Rupert and said, loud enough for all to hear, "We need to talk." He gestured toward the back room. They disappeared behind the door. The murmuring began before it even shut. Miss Marple remained still. 10 minutes later, Rupert emerged, ashen-faced. "She wants to make a statement," he told Ivy. "To the Reverend. She's going to confess," Ivy whispered. Rupert didn't answer. He looked toward Miss Marple instead, and nodded. They met in the vestry. Geraldine sat before the Reverend's desk, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. Miss Marple sat to the side, unobtrusive but alert. "I didn't mean for him to die," Geraldine said for the second time. "I wanted to scare him, just enough that he'd leave. He said he had photos of me from years ago." "Photos?" Blunt asked. Geraldine nodded. "He said he'd send them to the papers, to my old conservatory in London. Said he could ruin me with one letter, all because I wouldn't fund his next scheme." "So you added something to his drink?" "I meant it for mine," she said. "I thought if he drank from it by accident, well, maybe it'd taste awful, and he'd stop trusting me." But then Rupert handed it to him. "And the substance?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Furniture polish, just a dash, mixed with lemon oil. I'd read once it caused vomiting, nothing fatal. I didn't know the whiskey would make it worse." Reverend Blunt was silent. Then he said, "I'll need to inform Inspector Graves." "There will be consequences, Geraldine." "I know." She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply nodded, as though relieved. As the church bell tolled 9, Miss Marple and the Reverend stepped outside into the cool night. "She's brave," Blunt said quietly. "She's tired," Miss Marple corrected. "There's a difference." Blunt looked at her. "You knew all along, didn't you?" "I suspected, but suspicions are like shadows, Reverend. You must wait for the right light to see the form." He chuckled faintly. "You always speak in riddles." "Not riddles," she said. "Reflections." She turned toward the village green, the lights of the pub flickering faintly in the distance. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, Mr. Griggs was still sorting records, and soon the proper papers would find their way into the hands of the right people. But for now, justice had spoken, quietly, humanely, and with the weight of all things finally said. Chapter 8. Sunday arrived with the kind of pale gold light that made even the moss on the gravestones shimmer. The air was clear, but the mood in Little Whibcombe was weighty, held together by glances exchanged over pews and whispers shared beneath wide-brimmed hats. Word had spread, not the full truth, just the shape of it. Geraldine Pratt had confessed something to Reverend Blunt. Rupert Bligh had admitted a mistake. Jasper Mottram's death was complicated. The village didn't know what it believed, only that something poisonous had settled into their quiet rhythms. Miss Marple sat near the back of the church, her gloves neatly folded in her lap. She watched not the pulpit but the people, Ivy Baxter glancing toward the choir loft every few minutes, Colin Lacey shifting in his seat with the guilt of someone who hadn't been part of anything but wished he had. And Rupert, seated at the far right aisle, stiff as a headstone, but pale with something deeper than shame. Geraldine was absent. The hymns passed gently, and Reverend Blunt's reading was deliberate. The truth shall set you free, but only if it is spoken. At the final amen, Miss Marple did not linger. She had another appointment in mind, and it had waited long enough. The Giggling Goose was closed again, though no sign declared it. Miss Marple found the door unlatched and slipped inside. The pub was quiet, dim even in daylight, shadows settling on the chairs like dust. Rupert stood behind the bar, polishing the brass taps with short, nervous motions. "She's gone," he said as Miss Marple entered. "I expected as much. She left a note for the Reverend. Said she'll speak to the inspector tomorrow. Properly." Miss Marple placed her handbag on the counter. "And how do you feel?" "Like a coward," Rupert muttered. "I let her do it. I let him push, and I just stood back." "You feared scandal. You feared losing everything you'd built. That fear is not unique." He looked at her. "And yet you always see through it?" She smiled faintly. "It's not hard. I've seen more damage done by silence than by rage. And people always imagine silence protects, but it corrodes." Rupert reached under the bar and placed a glass in front of her. "No whiskey, just water." Miss Marple took it, sipped, and then asked the question she'd been saving. "Why didn't you tell anyone about the second drink?" He froze. "Ivy said the glass Jasper had smelled of polish. But that wasn't the glass you gave him, was it?" Rupert's voice cracked. "No." Miss Marple nodded. "There was another. You swapped them." He sank onto the stool. "I didn't know what was in it. I just saw Geraldine holding the other glass, nervous, like she dipped something in. I thought maybe she was trying to calm her nerves, maybe just lemon oil, or her strange herbal things. I panicked. And so you switched it." "I didn't want her drinking something odd, so I gave that glass to him instead." Miss Marple was very still. "You gave Jasper the wrong drink." "I didn't mean to hurt him," Rupert whispered. "I was trying to protect her. I thought if she had done something foolish, it would be better he handled it than she. But I never imagined. You acted instinctively," Miss Marple said. "Not maliciously, but it changes things." That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Inspector Graves in Mudminster. She found him in his office, hunched over paperwork with the expression of a man enduring administrative penance. I need you to reopen the Jasper Mottram file, she said simply. Graves blinked. Miss Marple, with respect. Graves blinked. Miss Marple, with respect. The case was declared a natural death. Then came the confession. Now you're telling me, what, another version? A correction. Geraldine didn't serve the poisoned drink. She prepared it. Rupert unknowingly served it. Graves rubbed his forehead. That doesn't change much legally. It does morally. Graves studied her. You're asking me not to charge them? I'm asking you, she said evenly, to look at intent, consequence, and human nature. Miss Pratt acted out of desperation. Rupert out of misplaced protection. The result was tragic, but not malicious. He leaned back. You make it sound tidy. Hardly, Miss Marple said, but I find tragedy rarely is. It leaves frayed threads. That evening, a small note appeared on the church board. There will be no criminal proceedings in the matter of Jasper Mottram's death. By order of Inspector Graves. Case concluded. The village read it, whispered, and then, slowly, moved on. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her diary again. Justice is not always a courtroom. Sometimes it is a mirror held quietly before a person who must see the weight of what they've done, and choose whether to carry it or lay it down. She closed the book, her tea cooling beside her. Outside, the bells from the Giggling Goose rang once, just once, a toast not given, a silence acknowledged. But no one would forget the day the drink passed hands, not from poison, but from fear. And that fear, in the end, had found its reckoning. Chapter 9. The following week, the village of Little Wibcombe settled into a strange, reflective calm. The Giggling Goose reopened with less chatter and more careful glances. Geraldine Pratt was seen walking her spaniel again, a scarf wound tightly round her neck, even on warm afternoons. And Rupert Bligh poured drinks with a quieter hand, as if aware now of just how permanent the wrong glass could be. Miss Marple, however, sensed that the business with Jasper Mottram wasn't entirely finished. Yes, the death was explained. Yes, the police had closed the file. But her instincts told her something was still unsettled. Not in motive or method, but in origin. Jasper hadn't come to Little Wibcombe merely to cause discomfort or profit from a small pub. There had been a deeper scheme beneath the visible drama. And so, on the damp Monday morning, she paid a visit to the only person who might know what was missing. Mr. Griggs, the county records man, had taken a small room at the Redfern guest house. He was seated at a table in the front parlour, poring over yellowing folders with an expression of faint irritation. "You again," he said, not unkindly. "Come to quiz the paperwork." Miss Marple sat across from him. "You mentioned, when we last spoke, that some deeds were misfiled, that payments were made, but not signed for." "I did," he nodded. "Sloppy business, but not unheard of. Rural properties. Records go back a century or more. Hard to track without digital scans." "And did you ever confirm who last accessed the Giggling Goose's land file?" Griggs paused, then reached for a small black notebook. "Funny you should ask. Only one person requested it in the last 6 months. Geraldine Pratt." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Not Rupert Bligh?" "Number, and not Jasper Mottram either. At least not under his own name." He flipped another page. But someone else requested related documents. A man named Lewis Glenshaw claimed he was researching historical ownership for Iba, her book Miss Marple stilled. She knew that name. Lewis Glenshaw had been involved in a failed development project 2 years earlier in Muchminster. a scheme riddled with fraud and land grabs masked by charming pitches about rural revitalization. "May I take a look at the file?" she asked. Griggs raised a brow. "You're not a solicitor." "No," she said with a smile, "but I'm very good at following paper trails." 2 hours later, back in her cottage, Miss Marple laid out the photocopies like puzzle pieces, parcel maps, lease transfers, the original deed to the pub, and, folding among them, a curious sheet, one that didn't belong. It was a payment ledger. Not for the Giggling Goose, but for a set of surrounding properties. Small plots, useless farmland, a derelict stable, all recently acquired under shell companies, and all encircling the pub like a noose. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. So that was it. Jasper Mottram hadn't just wanted the pub. He wanted the entire corner of the village, not for development, but for sale, to Lewis Glenshaw and his shadowy investors. Quiet acquisition, flip for a profit, disappear. But someone had gotten cold feet, and someone else had taken matters into their own hands. That evening she returned to the Giggling Goose. Rupert was at the bar, polishing a tap with the air of someone waiting for ghosts. She placed the payment ledger in front of him. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then, "Where did you get this?" "It came with the deed files. I believe Jasper left it behind, or perhaps he meant it to be found eventually. Either way, it tells a very different story." Rupert stared at the list of properties. "This is everything around the pub, all of it, even that run-down mill behind the smithy." Miss Marple nodded. "A coordinated acquisition. Geraldine's involvement was likely deeper than we thought. Mottram was using her to access ownership, and perhaps she didn't realize until too late." "Why bring this now?" he asked, eyes narrow. "Because the mystery isn't truly solved until the full motive is known. And you deserve to know what he was taking, not just your pub, Rupert, but your village." Rupert looked stricken. He was going to gut the place. Miss Marple spoke gently. "He would have, had someone not intervened. But now the paper trail ends, the money stops flowing, and you must decide whether to reveal it to the villagers or let it remain buried." That night, Rupert posted a new notice on the pub door. "To those who care about Little Wibcombe, I was almost fooled, and I nearly let someone else destroy what we've built. But it stops here. The Goose stays ours." He said nothing else, but people read it, and for the first time in weeks, someone clapped him on the shoulder as they passed. Later that week, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlour, reading through her diary and sipping lukewarm tea. A knock came at the door. It was Geraldine. She held a small parcel, brown-papered, tied with string. She held a small parcel, brown-papered, tied with string. "It's all I had left of him," she said, placing it in Miss Marple's hands. "Letters, contracts, I want you to burn them." Miss Marple looked at her. "Are you sure?" Geraldine's voice was flat. "He made me complicit, in more ways than one, but not any more." Miss Marple nodded once. When Geraldine had gone, she placed the parcel in her hearth. She did not read them. She simply lit the match. Some confessions were better unspoken. Chapter 10. A week passed. The village breathed easier, though it had not quite returned to normal. The fair committee resumed meetings, minus Geraldine. Ivy Baxter had taken over music duties, though she couldn't sing, and admitted as much, cheerfully. "But at least I can keep time and avoid poisonings," she said, which drew uneasy laughter around the table. Rupert Bligh was quieter now, not solemn, but changed. His smiles were less performative, his gaze more introspective. He'd taken down the antique whiskey decanter behind the bar and replaced it with a dusty vase of lavender. A small tribute, he said, to no one in particular. As for Miss Marple, she spent more time in the garden, but the lines of concentration on her face had not relaxed. One thread still tugged at her. Jasper Mottram's death had been the culmination of many tensions, emotional, financial, moral. Geraldine had acted in fear, Rupert in panic. The broader scheme had been uncovered and stopped, and yet something still didn't fit. It was the way Jasper had died, so quietly, not gasping, not collapsing, just gone. The symptoms had aligned with alcohol poisoning, exacerbated by chemical exposure, yes, but there had been no vomiting, no convulsions, no sign of distress, only silence, too clean. Miss Marple returned to her notes. The whiskey glass, the switch, the scent of polish, and a phrase Rupert had used weeks ago, barely noticed at the time. I just thought she was using one of her strange herbal things. That was it. It hadn't been polish, or at least not entirely. It was time to visit Geraldine once more. She found her in the back garden of her cottage, trimming dead leaves from a pot of lemon balm. Geraldine looked thinner, her posture less proud. But she did not flinch when Miss Marple appeared at the gate. "I thought I might see you again," she said, brushing soil from her gloves. "Your tea blends," Miss Marple said gently. "You used to bring them to the committee meetings." Geraldine nodded. "For anxiety. I make my own. What's in them? Lavender, lemon balm, sometimes valerian. It helps with tension." "Why?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She reached into her handbag and produced a slip of paper. "May I show you something?" It was a photocopy of a coroner's report. Jasper Mottram's blood toxicity results, quietly completed after Inspector Graves. Curious to confirm, Miss Judd suggests Marple's suspicions had ordered one final test. Geraldine read it, then looked up, face pale. "Digitalis," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "Not from polish, from foxglove. Found in many gardens, and quite often misidentified when dried and crushed." Geraldine's eyes filled slowly with disbelief. She said, "I didn't know." "No," Miss Marple replied. "You didn't. You meant only to create discomfort. But you used the wrong herb. Perhaps it had mixed in your supply. Perhaps it was a careless handful, but it was deadly." Geraldine sank onto the bench beside the lavender. "So I did kill him. Not by design," Miss Marple said, "but by mistake, a dangerous one." They sat in silence for a long moment. "Will the police come again?" Geraldine asked quietly. Miss Marple shook her head. "Inspector Graves believes what's been suffered is punishment enough, and Rupert has chosen not to press anything further." Geraldine looked at the plant in her hands, as if seeing it for the first time. "I never wanted any of this," she said. "No one ever does," Miss Marple murmured, "but it finds us all the same." That evening, Miss Marple returned to the Giggling Goose. The fire was lit again, modest and warm. Ivy Baxter was humming off-key while arranging glassware. Rupert was bent over the bar, reading something. He looked up when she entered. "Is it over?" he asked softly. Miss Marple took the stool across from him. "As much as it can be." "She told you?" "She knows, and more importantly, understands." Rupert stared into the fire. "You know, the strange thing is, I don't hate her. I should, but I don't." "Hate and pity rarely hold hands for long," Miss Marple said. "You saw her desperation. That softens the edges. He gave a quiet laugh. She said she wanted to fix things, that this place had trapped her. "And now?" Miss Marple asked. "She left a letter," Rupert said. "Offered her shares, what little she might have had. Back to the village, no strings. She's trying to heal." Rupert met her eyes. "And you? Will you stay for the fair?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps, though I may forgo the lemonade this year." Later that night, in the privacy of her room, Miss Marple picked up her diary one last time. "The village breathes again, though not without scar. A woman wounded by fear, a man paralyzed by loyalty, and a stranger who brought greed disguised as charm. All collided beneath the sign of a laughing goose. And while the justice system will not record this case, the heart of the village will. Memory is a quieter court, but it never forgets." She laid her pen down. Outside, a wind stirred the trees, and from far off, the faint echo of laughter rang from the pub, its windows glowing with firelight and cautious joy. The giggling Goose still stood, and beneath it, all that had been broken began slowly to mend. Chapter 11. The May Day Fair arrived in Little Wibcombe with soft fanfare and a cautious smile. After weeks of tension and quiet reckonings, the village found its way back to bunting and jam jars, paper hats and lemon curd. The bunting hung slightly uneven above the green, and the maypole tilted just so, but the effort had heart. Miss Marple, dressed in lavender with a brooch shaped like a teacup, stood near the cake table, inspecting a lemon drizzle loaf with mild suspicion. "Too perfect," she murmured to Ivy Baxter beside her. "I don't trust symmetrical icing." Ivy grinned. "Made by Colin Lacey's sister. Uses a ruler. Then I shall opt for the scone. Unevenness often means honesty." The laughter between them was warm. Some things had returned to ease. And yet the wound still lingered beneath the surface, stitched, not healed. Geraldine had left the village quietly 3 days earlier, just after signing a formal renunciation of any claim to the pub or adjacent properties. She left a short note to Rupert, one to the Reverend, and none to Miss Marple. That omission did not offend. Some words, after all, could not be written. Rupert, for his part, had returned to the fair committee. There he sat further from the head of the table and spoke less. When someone asked about the pub's future, he only said, "It'll stay here as long as we do." But Miss Marple still felt the presence of something unfinished. A faint misalignment. The crime had been tragic, yes, explained, consequences accepted. But some thread of motive, some detail of timing, still nagged at her, quietly but persistently. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the fair was in full swing and the village choir, newly cobbled together under Ivy's wobbly leadership, sang a slightly out-of-tune version of Greensleeves, that Miss Marple spotted the final detail. She had wandered near the prize table, where a silver trophy for best goose drawing sat atop a lace cloth. Several children had submitted artistic interpretations of the pub's namesake, most involving googly eyes and far too many feathers. But it was not the drawings that caught her attention. It was the ledger, carelessly left beneath the table by one of the fair assistants. She picked it up and turned the cover. Inside were hand-scribbled notes for event planning, committee expenses, and at the back a copied map of the fair layout. That someone had reused the back of an old sheet, perhaps by mistake, perhaps by habit. It was a page from the original property ledger, with handwritten annotations, notes not in Geraldine's script. One line was underlined twice in red ink. Foxglove harvest, store behind ale crates, keep away from heat. Miss Marple's eyes froze. That wasn't Geraldine's handwriting. It was Rupert's. And suddenly the weight shifted. She returned to the pub just before twilight. Rupert was behind the bar, clearing away bunting scraps and spare napkins. The windows were flung open. The air smelled of fried onions and damp grass. "May I trouble you?" she asked. "Of course." She placed the page on the counter. Rupert looked at it. Didn't flinch. "So," she said softly, "it wasn't a mistake." He met her gaze. "No." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "All this time you let us believe Geraldine added the wrong herb, that she'd mixed foxglove in with her tea leaves. But this note, it's yours. You kept it. You harvested it." Rupert's voice was a rasp. "I thought it would be needed if he pushed too far. And when he did, I made a choice." She remained very still. "You gave him the glass on purpose." "I did." Miss Marple exhaled. "But why let Geraldine believe she did it?" Rupert looked hollow now. "Because she believed it already. I saw it on her face, and she was willing to carry it. I thought maybe that was justice, a shared weight. And now she left the village thinking she'd killed a man. And you let her." Rupert didn't answer. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "You're not a bad man, Mr. Bligh, but you are a proud one, and pride has a way of hiding behind sacrifice." He closed his eyes. "Jasper threatened everything I had. He mocked the pub, the village, Geraldine. He said we were all artifacts, collectibles, and that he'd turn us into a brand. So you killed him." "No," Rupert said softly. "I ended something, but I've never called it killing, not out loud." Miss Marple said nothing. Some truths, when named, became too heavy to lift again. Later, Miss Marple stood alone on the edge of the green, the wind tugging at the corner of her shawl. Music drifted faintly from the pub. Rupert had turned on the old gramophone, letting a slow, crackling jazz tune fill the air. The laughter had returned to the Giggling Goose. But beneath it, a quieter story whispered. The kind not passed down in records or police files. The kind that lived only in memory, and perhaps in the conscience of one man behind one bar. Chapter 12. The days that followed the fair were quieter still, placid on the surface, but introspective underneath, as if the village had collectively exhaled after holding its breath too long. There were fewer glances, fewer whispers. The villagers, so prone to gossip, now found themselves strangely reverent. Perhaps they sensed that something serious had passed among them. Or perhaps, for once, they'd been close enough to truth to be silenced by it. The Giggling Goose no longer displayed its closed for inventory sign. It was open now every evening, but not bustling. No loud darts matches, no shouting at the wireless. Just slow conversation and slow pints, like the pub which remembered how to be a place for community instead of conflict. Miss Marple had not spoken to Rupert Bligh since their conversation over the ledger. She had not returned to the pub. She did not need to. Some truths, once acknowledged, no longer required repetition. She spent her days pruning her roses and mending a tablecloth that had sat half-finished since the first frost. She slept deeply, knowing the worst had passed. But that final thread still waited. The reckoning not with the village, or the police, or even Geraldine, but with Rupert himself. It came on a Monday morning, unannounced, as many reckonings do. He arrived with a brown paper parcel and a solemn face. Ivy had handed him Miss Marple's address without asking questions. No one else saw him cross the garden path or knock lightly at her door. "Come in," Miss Marple said before he could speak. He stepped inside, holding the parcel like it might break. "I won't stay long," Rupert said. "Just something I think you should have." She gestured toward the sitting room. "Please." He sat, placing the parcel gently on the table. "After you left the pub that night, I couldn't sleep. I looked through the back cabinet. Thought I might throw out everything connected to that night." "And did you?" "Not quite." He untied the string and unfolded the wrapping. Inside was a plain porcelain teacup, white with a thin silver rim. The kind Jasper had used when he first came into the Goose, before he'd upgraded to whiskey. "Geraldine used to brew his tea," Rupert said, "before the whiskey phase started. One night I asked why. She said it helped calm him. I think it was her way. He said it helped calm him. I think it was her way of trying to gain his trust again." Miss Marple turned the teacup slowly in her hands. On the underside, a faint brown stain lingered near the handle. Faint, but sharp in its curve. "A foxglove tincture," she murmured. Rupert nodded. "She must have started with tea, not the whiskey. That was just a final attempt." Miss Marple looked at him, thoughtful. "So even before the poisoning, she'd been dosing him. Tiny amounts," Rupert said. "I think it started as a bluff, a show of power. But something changed. Maybe he caught on. Maybe she realized it wasn't enough. Either way, it wasn't just one glass that killed him. It was a path they were both already walking." He didn't sit. He looked out the window instead, where bees drifted around her lavender bushes. "I'll never really know which glass did it, or whose hand tipped the scale. But I made sure he took the one I handed him. That part I do know." Miss Marple didn't reply. Rupert finally said, "Do you think that makes me a murderer?" She studied him for a long moment. "No," she said softly. "I think it makes you a man who let fear guide him, who let someone else carry guilt so he wouldn't have to look at his own, but not a murderer." His shoulders sagged. She added, "You gave a man a drink." But his death had been poured long before, over many months, by many hands. Rupert nodded quietly. "And now?" she asked. "I'm leaving the Goose?" Miss Marple's brow rose. He explained, "The brewery's willing to buy it again, under better terms, and Ivy's agreed to manage it. I'll still own the name, the walls, but I'll step away." Miss Marple regarded him. "Why?" "Because I don't want to hold the place where it happened. I don't want to grow old behind that bar, wondering if I was brave, or just cowardly in a quieter way." She nodded. "And the village? They'll survive, maybe better." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned the teacup to her china cabinet. Not to keep, just to hold for a while, as a reminder. The fair ribbons still hung across the green, fluttering in the late spring breeze. The children now ran past them without noticing. Laughter had returned to the post office queue. A soft tune drifted out of the pub. No longer jazz, but a waltz from a gramophone that needed winding. Miss Marple sat in her parlour and poured herself tea. The cup did not tremble. Not today. Chapter 13. A month later, the only trace of Jasper Mottram in Little Wibcombe was a folded newspaper clipping in the village archive. "Sudden death at village pub. No foul play suspected." The headline lay sandwiched between a recipe for jam tarts and the announcement of a new vicar's arrival in Muchminster. There had been no arrest, no trial, only the small, invisible sentence of those left behind, guilt, reflection, and the long work of healing. The Giggling Goose, now under Ivy Baxter's management, had found its new rhythm. The jazz records had been replaced with folk tunes and fiddle reels. Ivy introduced Pie and Puzzle Tuesdays, where the regulars competed to solve jigsaw puzzles while consuming shepherd's pie. No one mentioned Jasper anymore. They noticed that Rupert Bligh was no longer behind the bar, and that silence echoed louder than any music. He had moved to a cottage on the far side of the village, near the footpath that led into the woods. He could often be seen trimming hedges or fixing a cracked gate. He spoke little, smiled rarely. But when he nodded to passers-by, the gesture was genuine. He no longer carried weight in his shoulders, but he carried something deeper, quietly and without demand for absolution. Miss Marple, for her part, received a letter from Geraldine a fortnight after Rupert's visit. "Dear Miss Marple, I do not know what you said to Rupert, but I sense it was not cruel. I am grateful for that. I am staying with my cousin in Surrey. I've taken a post at a local library and joined a small choir. We do not sing well, but we sing honestly. I don't think I shall return to Little Whipcombe, but I have finally forgiven myself for not being the person I once thought I had to be. Thank you for seeing me clearly, even when I couldn't. Yours sincerely, Geraldine." Miss Marple read it 3 times. Then tucked it behind a stack of old train schedules in her side drawer, where she kept things too meaningful to display. One soft, rain-polished morning, the Reverend Blunt invited Miss Marple to tea in the vicarage garden. It was early summer by then, and the roses were in full bloom. He poured her a cup with a slightly unsteady hand and asked, "Do you ever feel, after these things, that you've been changed by them?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the question settle. "Changed, yes. Hardened, no." Blunt nodded. "There was a time I believed justice was a sharp thing, clear, decisive. But this—" he shook his head. "I still don't know if we did the right thing." "We didn't do anything," Miss Marple said gently. "We merely watched what people chose to do when no one was watching." "Still," he murmured, "it leaves a mark." She smiled faintly, "as it should." Later that day, Miss Marple returned home and fetched her diary for the final time on the matter. She opened it to a fresh page, dipped her pen in ink, and wrote, "Justice is not a loud conclusion, but a quiet comprehension. Some truths are confessed, others are lived with." In the end, Little Whipcombe did not change. Not really. It returned to what it had always been. A place where people hide their hurts with politeness, where mistakes bloom quietly in tea-shops and churchyards, and where redemption, if it comes, does so not with fanfare, but in the simple act of staying, of tending the garden, of not leaving when it would be easier to forget. She paused, tapped the pen once against the page, then added, "And the Giggling Goose still stands, not laughing, but listening, and that, perhaps, is enough." That evening, Miss Marple stood by her garden wall and looked toward the distant rooftops of the village. The steeple of the church glowed faintly in the setting sun. A group of children laughed near the baker's shop. Ivy's voice rang from the pub, scolding someone for dropping a tray. And behind it all, underneath and within, was the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of understanding.